But brands like James Cook University, like Macquarie University, universities are also undergoing rebranding in many ways. And this is the latest branding, if you like, from my university. It used to be like the scallops, they changed it now. Macquarie have returned to the lighthouse and the Sirius star. Okay, again, this particular colour is supposed to symbolise boldness and looking ahead to the future. And of course, we can all see that very clearly in the branding, that's what is intended. There are some co-authors on this paper, and it would be remiss of me to, of course, take all the credit, as much as I could do that and they wouldn't know about it. But therefore, of course, Tek Yong Eng, he's a professor at the University of Southampton, a sort of friend of mine who I've known for a number of years. Sina, I don't know that well at all, in fact, so the connection was really through Tek. Tek is Malaysian, but has spent 20 plus years working in the UK at various business schools. So this is a paper that he and I have worked on particularly, and with Sina. This is effectively the paper structure, and so you almost know then in a very conscious and planned way how long it is before we can get to go out of here in that sense. So when you see the number 4, you know, we've only got until 6, okay? So, and of course, we do say 6, not sucks, socks, or anything else that will do it. So that is one of the nuances of New Zealand accents. We mispronounce certain words. So we'll go quickly through the introduction, the setup of the paper, some of the literature, if you like, in a classic sense, the methodology. I do have a copy of the paper, of course, and that can be sent. A lot of these things, I won't sort of really get into the boring aspects of the paper in that regard. Neither will I present all of the figures that will sort of make us quite giddy. I do have all of those figures, but the reality of trying to present that and cram it into a PowerPoint slide these days has become, I think, increasingly meaningless. So I think it's easier to go through the hypotheses as you've got there in your slides. What that really means, the results, of course, and what we can take away from this in terms of both sort of some theory, but also some practice. What does it mean for business today and for managers? These are, of course, the sorts of key words that we're looking at: brand image, brand loyalty. There's some ethnocentrism aspect here. And really the sorts of ideas that we're capturing in this paper are things to do with business around the world, particularly large international businesses, have choices about where they make or manufacture their particular brands and their products or services. And also what that actually means for consumer buying behaviour. You know, so it's a mixture, if you like, of international business, of marketing and strategy, because these are also influencing business strategic choices. And what we're trying to do here particularly is looking at what we call the country of origin effect. You know, where is a particular brand, if you like, from? And what we've really discussed or discovered through the literature is there's 2 elements to this country of origin. And in fact, there is brand origin, okay, as well as the second one, the country of production. Now, of course, we all know where Guinness beer is produced, St James Gate in Dublin. But of course, today, the Guinness label, like many other breweries around the world, are produced under licence in many different countries. So when you drink Guinness in Ireland, for example, it always tastes better than drinking Guinness anywhere else in the world for some reason. Okay, the Irish will say there's a very good reason for that, because the water is clearly better in Ireland than anywhere else in the world, okay, among other explanations. So those are the sorts of things we're particularly interested in. And when we look at the country of production, businesses have the option, if you like, of trying to cut costs by relocating. Okay, many of us are familiar with the outsourcing of particular services or products to countries that have a lower cost structure. Okay, all things being equal, we can see why that can be a particularly attractive option for business managers, particularly senior business people. But at the same time, this also creates a series of risks. In other words, if you're going to take your brand, which is reasonably reputable and there is value, there is tangible as well as intangible value around that brand, what does that actually mean for the value and the valency, if you like, of the particular brand? Now, we know, for example, we're all in, or many of us at least, are in the higher education business, the higher education sector, which has become increasingly globalised with respect to offshoring and campuses open. So James Cook, for example, has opened a campus here in Singapore. RMIT, Monash as well, are particularly international in their orientation. US universities, British universities and all the rest. They can set up, if you like, campuses and branding around the world. So the brand origin might be in the US, but its degrees, its diplomas may be in fact diffused and offered in different countries around the world. Now, I know for a fact that, for example, Oxford University is not entering this. Their argument is that if you set up Oxford in New Delhi, that in fact it poses a risk to the brand. You cannot in fact replicate punting on the river down through Oxford. You cannot replicate the Oxford buildings, the green grass, the whole ambient experience of students on bikes and gowns going to the pub and doing all the sorts of things that you do in the Oxford experience. So this is what we're meaning by to what extent can organisations use their brands, their products, to actually locate, produce, make, manufacture them in countries other than their actual origin. So that's, if you like, the sort of setup. And what we see here is this notion, we have country of origin effect. There is power even in countries, okay? These are just some examples. Made in America signals something. And also for a while, there was, I think, a fairly pejorative sense of made in China. You would look at your shirts, a very expensive shirt or blouse, and then of course made in China. And for some reason, made in China was almost undermining the actual quality of a status type of product. Swiss made, of course. Swiss have a reputation for high quality, okay, in a range of areas, whether they're army knives, watches, or any of those sorts of products. You'll see, of course, down on the far right, made in Bangladesh, and of course made in North Korea on the far left. Okay, I'm not actually sure what is made in North Korea. I haven't ever seen anything, maybe because products never leave North Korea. Okay, New Zealand made, Australian made, South Africa made in Britain. All of these send some sort of information cues, if you like. Attitudes are shaped, they're influenced by messages like this. So we're particularly interested in attitude theory, we're particularly interested in information processing and the cues and clusters of signals that statements and images and brands send to the world and particularly send to consumers. So our particular contribution, as I've sort of defined, so I'm sort of catching up with things here, what we really don't know is what this really means across countries, and particularly for companies that have brands diffused around the world. They're making their products and services in different countries. So what we do know, we know enough about single countries, we know enough about certain contexts, but what we don't know is really the developed and the developing. We usually know one setting, but not the other. So this is, to our knowledge at least, the first time that there's been an attempt to try and better explain how consumers in a developing country and consumers in a developed country respond to brands that are actually made in both developed and developing countries. So what we actually do there, you'll see there, is that we're comparing a developed country. We've got data, and we'll come to that shortly, from the UK, the United Kingdom, and also data from consumers from China, okay, mainland China, on an international brand. We pick one brand for a particular reason, Sony, because this is a high-tech company. It's a high-tech company. It's a relatively sort of status-oriented product, high-tech electronics. There's a range of products through it. We all know the Sony brand. It's of course Japanese, but it's produced in a range of countries besides Japan. So what does this really mean, if you like, for consumer behaviour, and particularly strategies about where you locate your production, and also what this may mean for customers who will then buy your product? So if you like, the setup is such that if you are looking for a short-term cost reduction in your production and manufacture, at the same time you have to be incredibly careful if that short-term cost reduction exposes you to greater reputational and other risk among consumers who choose not to buy your product because of where it is produced. Okay, and so we really need to, if you like, unpack that sort of question. Okay, so if you can imagine, this is really what we're trying to do graphically. We take Sony up there, and we want to see, for two sets of consumers from a developed country in the UK, a developing country in China, but to see where what that means with respect to where it is actually produced. In China, which is a developed country, so you're producing a high-tech product from a developed country, selling it to consumers in another developed country. We're varying that with a developing country, Malaysia, and what that actually means also for the same British consumers. We then do the same with our Chinese consumers. So this is probably a more sort of a nuanced approach that hasn't yet been done, okay, by comparing this sort of, if you like, these four aspects to it. So that's effectively the setup, and we use Malaysia as a reference point with regard to our developing and developed worlds. So this is intended to try and give managers, as well as I guess us who are interested in research, but particularly this does speak quite strongly, we believe, to management and to management practice. It was interesting today, just on a very small aside, I was teaching a number of undergraduate students here, and they asked a simple question, and they said, the research that we're reading as part of the unit or module that I'm teaching, who is it written for? Okay, in other words, is it useful in practice? Okay, and to some extent, a lot of the research that we actually do produce ends up being in a pretty, I guess, narrowly read and transmitted outlets in many ways through academic peer review. And so we're appreciative of that by trying to highlight particularly the theoretical but also the practical implications. How does this research actually say something to practicing business people today, as well as satisfy some of the other sorts of methodological and theoretical aspects? So we're particularly concerned about how these issues will be in the forefront of management minds with regard to how do they leverage their brand? What does that actually mean? How do we better utilise the brand power? Brands can actually wax and wane, they can improve in time, they can decrease. Things can certainly happen, both attributable to organisational decisions, but also through happenstance, through serendipity and good fortune or misfortune. And the country of production, where is the particular product or service produced? And if we have knowledge of that, what does that mean for consumer behaviour? So as we can see up there, we're particularly interested in the congruity, if you like, between the brand name and the country of production. So we know this. I haven't even mentioned what it is, but this is such a recognisable and powerful brand. Okay, it's high-end brand. Okay, it's a very high-end brand. We expect the congruity between the brand Mercedes-Benz to be produced in Germany. Germany has a reputation. They're as boring as anything in many ways, but they're as efficient in terms of that. They have a reliability. The Germans are as punctual as anything. They're efficient. They're very good people to work with. But Germans are not known for flair. That's the Italians and the French. Germans are not known for stand-up comedy for obvious reasons, okay? These are clearly stereotypes. But the point is that these stereotypes around a country and around a brand reinforces the high status, high quality of Mercedes-Benz. So what does this mean if all of a sudden consumers had knowledge that their SLK 350, okay, I think that's a model, was suddenly made in that country on our right? And of course we all know which flag that one is, Papua New Guinea. Okay, so we have a very developed country with a reputation for engineering excellence, superb, everything is superb in Germany. You know, that's just this country image, of course, being made in a very developing and rather agrarian economy to some extent. This is incongruent, okay? This is what we mean about the congruity and incongruity, and what this means in the minds of consumers and consumer behaviour. So you can imagine that's the incongruent type of example. Sort of going in, if you like, a little bit here, country of origin. So mindful of this, moving on, and the consumer product origins here. And of course, the country of origin is where consumers associated it, the product as being sourced, regardless of where the product is actually produced. Now, of course, the previous slide, Mercedes-Benz, of course we attribute that to Germany, okay. But many of us probably also know that many of the items that go into the componentry, the copper, into the electronics are probably coming out of course, Zambia. Windshields may be produced in Vietnam. The tyres may be an aspect of Brazil. Of course, the global production networks and where the sourcing and resourcing of materials that make up the final product are pretty much coming from all around the world. Okay, so the made in label, made in the USA, or made in, is to some extent true, but at the other hand, we also need to be mindful that many of the component elements that make up some very sophisticated and high-end products like motor vehicles are sourced around the world. Shirts are a different thing. Now, I was slightly alarmed, for example. I have one or two quite flash shirts, you know, very expensive shirts that I picked up, and I did discover that one or two of them were made in Bangladesh. Okay, now again, my immediate reaction was that I'd paid a lot of money for an Italian shirt, and my Italian shirt with Italian label on it kind of slightly disappointed me when I read the fine print that in fact had been produced in Bangladesh. So what does this sort of activity create in the minds of consumers when it comes to repurchase behaviour, or behaviour where, unlike cars, you want more frequent purchasing? Okay, so those are the sorts of things that we're particularly interested in. Product quality. Okay, we know that countries send signals about something in some way. Singapore, Israel, the Swiss, they will conjure up images in the minds of consumers, whether we like it or we don't like it. And we can cultivate that to our advantage. Let perceptions and level of risk, as we say here, whether we have a watch that's made in Morocco or in Switzerland. Now, I can share a true story. I was in Pisa, Italy, a few years ago on a holiday, and I had the opportunity to buy a Rolex watch for €10 for a Rolex. Now, I thought, what a bargain, absolute bargain. Needless to say, I didn't purchase it for obvious reasons. You know, a Rolex for €10 was clearly a counterfeit, wasn't it? Okay, and of course I have also been in Morocco, where I've also had plenty of opportunities to buy some very expensive Parisian labels. Okay, needless to say, I also resisted the temptation to come off the plane looking like a rock star. Okay, or in Switzerland. So here what we've got is, if you like, these cognitive, these affective, these aesthetic responses to particular countries. Now, of course, I couldn't resist putting New Zealand on the slide just once more. And we'll see here that even New Zealand creates an image around purity and around natural. All the pictures of New Zealand, anything to do with New Zealand, whether it's butter, wine, livestock, anything to do with that, you've got the view that it's pure and untainted. Okay, so there's a national cashing in or capitalising on a country's perceived image, which is also marketed in New Zealand's case by the New Zealand Tourism Board and the government. So this is a deliberate strategy in parts of the world where there is anything but pure aspects. There's high levels of pollution, there's all of this stuff, environmental degradation and all of that. New Zealand, with 4 million people, is larger than the United Kingdom. So you imagine all of Singapore can fit into New Zealand many times over. Okay, so this notion of space, you've got plenty of it in New Zealand, and it's pure, it's got mountains, and so they cash in on that as a brand. Any New Zealand product is got a view like that. Country of production and consumer product evaluation. Okay, this is the country that produces or assembles the branded product. And again here, it's also linked a little bit with information processing theory. I'm not going to go overboard with theory because I know we've got a very diverse group of people here, and I'd rather us just get the sort of the key message and make it informative and interesting. Okay, motivated consumers effectively say that we're not just going to look at where it's based, where the country of production is. If we're a highly motivated consumer, we're a bit discriminating. We're not purely basing our decisions on price alone. Price is important. Where it's produced is important, but we're a little bit more discriminating. Whereas the idea being that less motivated consumers are probably going to look for particular cues for quality or not quality. Okay, so if we have a high level of motivation and I'm looking for a watch, I will probably spend a little bit of time researching watches, understanding history of watches, where the best watches are made, price, and all of those sorts of things will come into mind. If I don't really care about it, and if I'm not that motivated, well, clearly, I'm not going to be looking so extensively and doing the research into that search behaviour when it comes to that. And of course, what we're not sure about, as indicated at the start, was really both the developed and the developing country. The studies that we've seen look at one but not the other. And so Tech and I and Sina wanted to do a bit more. So broadly speaking, we've come to, just out of those A and B slides, we've got a number of hypotheses that we sort of, we do test. We don't sort of test them, we actually do test them. And so what we're saying is that the country of production in a developed country, such as Japan, will have a positive influence on the evaluation of Sony products. Okay, so there's a congruence element to H1. H1B, of course, is saying that if it's produced in a developing country, it will have a negative evaluation on a brand. So here's the incongruence coming through. So we're trying to test whether this is also going to affect things. I talked a minute ago about the high consumer motivation. We're also going to say that that's going to influence choice made in a developing country, and also low motivation is going to make and it is negatively going to be associated as well. So we wanted to see that because we didn't put the word developed in the hypothesis predominantly because Sony is coming from a developed country context, you see, and being produced by Japanese company. So that was the particular reason and the logic for that one. We've got a few more hypotheses, and we wanted to kind of look at the brand origin, where it's from. As we've kind of indicated, slightly already intimated, that also the brand image will impact or work together with the country of production, okay, and the brand origin, like Israel, Singapore, Sweden, and of course Switzerland down there, okay. And you generally tend to look around the world, and it's the countries that almost have almost a wealth of riches and natural resources, you know, the Middle East with oil, Australia with a lot of dirt and iron ore and coal. These are countries that are often endowed with particular natural and other resources. But many of the countries that have the reputation for innovation, of high tech, of real problem solving are often the countries that don't have anything in the way of natural resources. These are the countries that have actually had to solve problems for themselves. So your most innovative countries in terms of the high reputation countries for innovation are, unsurprisingly, Israel. Okay, now Israel literally has a lot of sand, okay, but out of Israel they've made a particularly vibrant society. Their research and development is second to none. Okay, their expenditure on defence, of course, is also second to none as a proportion of GDP, and we know why that might be. You take Singapore again, no natural resources, but done incredibly well. The Netherlands, okay, low-lying, forever getting flooded. The Dutch have a particularly good way of solving real problems, as do the Swiss, landlocked, but of course that they produce excellent products and services, you know, in a range of areas, including pretty handy tennis players. So we'll look at that. The Scandinavians, of course, you know, they're efficient. They're like the Germans in many ways, the Swiss. So what we're seeing is, you know, style and design. Look, you know, Scandinavians particularly, IKEA in Sweden, many other companies, Nokia, of course, Finland. These have very positive brand images, okay, associated with the country, design, prestige, durability, quality, and so on. So where the country is based will also have particular favourable aspects. So what we're saying here is a congruent brand origin, country of production will have a positive effect. And of course the incongruent will have a joint negative effect on the evaluation of Sony products. So again, in many ways, some of us might be thinking, well, in some ways this is a little bit like dissonance theory, classic cognitive dissonance, you know, in some ways, you know, where you've got an attitude but somehow your behaviour and your attitudes are not kind of aligned. So here we're kind of using that sort of general sort of principle about congruence and incongruence, and why brand equity and the value of the brand, like Mercedes-Benz and other high-end products, LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, you know that as a brand is very powerful. You see a lot of brands down Orchard Road, okay, very, very prestigious, status-oriented brands. And really one aspect here is the loyalty to the brand. That is where people will return and repeat and repurchase. So your next time you acquire a particular item, you will again go back to the same sort of brand. You know, you want to repeat it. We often fly particular airlines. In part that's because of the frequent flyer program. In reality, we probably don't get that much value out of a frequent flyer program, really. But we often go back because it's a loyalty aspect, you know, whether we're supporting our own country or we're supporting the brand because there's a perception that this brand is reliable, it's robust, it adds value, okay? Business people can see value in brands, okay? Brand management is big business. Managing people's brand is big business. We're seeing that at the moment in the US with the presidential kind of runoffs leading into branding of people. Okay, so people can be branded in as much the same way as bottles of water. Organisations like James Cook University and other things, countries can also have brand. And so really what we're saying is, how does this influence commitment, loyalty, and of course subsequently repurchase decisions? Brands, of course, are in memories. And of course people have fond memories of things. You know, growing up, of course, you know, you would have particular household brands and names. You know, in Australia it was Jockey for me, you know, Jockey. The Jockey singlet, okay, was something we used to wear as kids because it only came in one colour, white, okay. That's all, it came in one colour. Now, unfortunately, you can't put that in the wash because it comes out pink or blue or some shade. But when we grew up, we had this view of just, you know, New Zealand being pure. Of course, we had Jockey singlets, you know, that was it. But this thing about long-term memory is there, and so organisations want to cultivate that long-term memory, adapt their brands, of course, adapt their products, but retain the fondness, the attachment that consumers have to that particular item. Again, men amongst us would remember, some of us at least, Old Spice. Old Spice. I loved the smell of Old Spice when I was a boy. Not that I used it as a boy, I can tell you, but my grandfather did. And I used to go into the cupboard and I used to smell this Old Spice. There was something for me that was pleasant. So even the aesthetics and the smell or the experience has long-term memory in the brand. I don't buy Old Spice today, I've moved on from it. But if I had the opportunity, I probably would for old time's sake, okay? So here what we're saying is we'll pay a higher price, and I would pay a higher price if I could find Old Spice for old time's sake, with a favourable country image than in countries less favourably regarded. So it's again, what's the perception of our countries like Malaysia versus Japan, okay, in terms of where it's produced? What do British and Chinese consumers, using that as a filter, think of a Japanese product, if you like, through Sony? So these are the nuancing effects, and we're making a case here, of course, and there's more to the story through the paper, but from a presentation point of view, brand image will have a positive effect on evaluation for Sony products, regardless of where it's produced, okay? It will also have a positive influence on evaluation of, brand loyalty will also have a positive. So the key variable change there is the brand loyalty versus the brand image. And what we're saying in a developing country, we're going to hypothesise, which we did, and we justified that properly through the paper, it was that price will have a negative effect on consumer product decisions. Because of course, you're in a developing country, you're more price sensitive than consumers in a developed country. So intuitively, and there was an argument, we sustained that, but intuitively it makes sense. We're more price conscious when we have less disposable income, among other things. So that was sort of the justification. And our final hypothesis, because we wanted to add an additional aspect to it, was also around consumer ethnocentrism. And you'll see up there, and I apologise for this, but it says buy locally. This notion of somehow we're Singaporeans, let's buy our own products because it's about supporting the local economy. We've been in Australia, Ken and I and others, and we've had this, you know, you've got to buy and eat your beef to support the farmers, okay? All of these things, it's about sort of a nationalism, a patriotism about your own products, particularly that. And what we were particularly interested to also examine was whether ethnocentric behaviours and attitudes among consumers were also going to influence perceptions of brand. Okay, in other words, should we actually buy Sony products if we're British or Chinese consumers? Or should we look to buy our own products that are equivalent? The other aspect that we also thought was quite important was animosity, because obviously the history between China and Japan, perhaps over the last century, hasn't, shall we say, been the best. Neither has it sort of more recently also been. There's been some strains there, but clearly there is some living memory of some of the atrocities, shall we say, that were committed by the Japanese in China during that occupation. And so we wanted to also be mindful of whether we were exploring animosity or ethnocentric behaviour. The British, again, we wanted to see whether that was something that would influence them, that they were only looking to buy British-made or preferred British-made. So, of course, we might do that. And, of course, the issue might be now that we're not quite sure where some of these very large brands are made. There may be, in fact, confusion in the minds of consumers now. We know McDonald's started in the US, but now I'm kind of even confused because I can see that there is halal, kosher, all the sorts of versions and variations in the burgers. So I'm almost seeing the classic hamburger being so changed and modified that I'm not quite sure now. And if that's perhaps occurring, we could speculate that that might also be the case with other consumers, that people may not know where Coca-Cola really comes from, particularly if you're a consumer that just has drunk this sugary sweet drink since you were young, but we're never quite sure about where it came from, although that you know it's everywhere. Okay, so this is the other thing that we are not quite sure about, whether people are able to associate brands with a particular country of origin. Do we know where each of these brands, like Sony, do we know with our sample where it's produced? So we're obviously going to say that that will have a positive influence. Now, intuitively, we might say, well, it should have a negative influence. But in fact, in reality, as we sort of went through and tried to justify the case, we found that in some cases there is no alternative. So even though you would like to buy Singaporean, we don't have the option, okay? You'd love to buy Singaporean wine if that was something that you enjoyed. The problem is, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's a vineyard here in Singapore. So that's what I mean. You'd love to buy it, but we have no choice. Okay, and so there are a couple of other reasons here also about that that actually led to that hypothesis, okay, rather than the opposite. A little bit on methodology, so we now speed up a lot more. 3 large cities in the UK, London, Manchester, Birmingham, and also in Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, which is just outside of Beijing. So again, we were looking at not rural settings for consumers, for fairly affluent, people who could afford potentially Sony products. We did it was an online test, online questionnaire. We pre-tested it with 25 consumers in each country just to make sure. It was translated into Mandarin, then translated back into English to make sure nothing was lost in translation, the usual sort of checks and balances. This online questionnaire was open for about 2 months in the middle of 2013, mid-2013. We ended up with roughly similar numbers of British and Chinese consumers here. I haven't given the standard deviations and all of that stuff. I just want to give you the narrative of the story rather than get us lost in the forest of numbers. Here we've got, male, and obviously the converse is female. Average age, they're not too dissimilar, slightly more men than women in China than the UK. We used one brand to ensure that there wasn't a contamination effect, that Sony, we needed to almost control any other possibility. If we'd added in another electronics producer, Boise, let's say Boise, B-O-I-S-E, okay, and I'm not even sure where they're produced, but we could imagine that we could have added another one into the equation. We didn't think that would have provided enough, and in fact would have collapsed the paper for us. So we only looked at one particular brand, and I'll say a little bit more about implications. Measures, we used obviously Likert scales. I'm always kind of amused whether we say Likert or we like it a lot, Likert scale. When appropriate, we generally use previous studies, of course, constructs that have been well supported, dichotomous items to obviously give us a logistic regression equation. I'm only putting that next line just to say, for researchers in the room, we did all the right things, okay? We effectively did all of that stuff, and, you know, I won't bore you with all of that detail, reliability tests and so on. So really, you know, from a methodological point of view, we did all the sorts of things you would expect. Now, results. Of course, the brand, while the perceived brand origin was important in the buying decision, the Chinese consumers were much more interested in the country of production than were British consumers, okay? And partly we were starting to see some evidence from these hypotheses there about that, particularly about avoiding buying Japanese products. Now, we also checked, you know, and thought about what was happening in 2013 when the data was being collected to make sure, was there any particular sort of international relation occurring between Japan and China? Because, you know, like many of us, you know, I've also travelled in China. The news is perhaps not as open and free-flowing as perhaps we're accustomed to in countries outside of China. So sometimes people are influenced with what they're provided by state supported media outlets, of course, in China, and that reflects government policy much more so than in other countries. So what we really did find was certainly that British consumers were much more sensitive to the perceived image in terms of similarity between the country of origin and the country of production. So this congruity was important for consumers in a developed country, but less so, well actually not even significant rather, for statistically significant at least, for consumers from China. Our H2 and H3, because I guess you've got the slides there, you can always go back to each of those, but I thought it's easier to present a narrative around it. Concerning whether consumer motivation, and that's really what H1 and H2 were about, sorry, 2A, 2B, that wasn't supported. So again, really the consumer motivation wasn't an issue, whether it was high motivation to be, you know, investigating products and really doing that research, or low motivation where your sense of attachment, we didn't find that at all anywhere. So that was, again, helpful to not find that in a way. So often when we don't get our hypotheses supported, people think that that's a bad thing, but in many ways it's a good thing, because that actually closes a particular line of inquiry for us. 3A and 3B, contrasting results again. So again, it's kind of interesting, there's starting to be some differences between our consumers in developed and developing countries. It was certainly significant for our British consumers. That was very important when Sony was made in Japan. British consumers particularly wanted Sony products made in Japan, not Malaysia. This was about signalling the quality. These are developed consumers from a developed country want to know that products made by developed country are also produced in a developed country. This is a sort of a reassurance about quality, reliability, and so on. It wasn't significant when Sony's products were made in Malaysia, okay? But it was for the Chinese consumers. Again, Chinese consumers had a preference that it in fact be made in Malaysia, not Japan, because also we were thinking, you know, what is it that the Japanese have this antithesis, sorry, the Chinese consumers have the antithesis towards Sony being made in Japan, okay? They preferred it being made in Malaysia. So straight away we should, as brand and other managers, be starting to think about this kind of fairly complex set of outcomes when you're marketing and manufacturing and trying to sell products to different countries, okay? So here we are certainly starting to see some discriminating factors. Our last four hypotheses here, again, talked about has a positive effect on the evaluation. Not supported for British, but significant for our Chinese consumers. Okay, it did have it wasn't supported there for the brand image. For the brand loyalty, only for the British consumers, made in Japan. Again, we're coming back to this congruence element about British consumers and the loyalty. We want to know that things are made where we think they should be made from a reputation and reliability point of view. A little bit of a surprise, but there it was. Price. Consumers are still pretty price conscious regardless of the country. We're seeing that. It was significant for both, and particularly when it was made in a developing country. So here they were more conscious of the Sony product being made in Malaysia from a price perspective. There was this question, will it be any good? Are we getting value for money? That kind of question didn't really emerge when it was with respect to the developed country, Japan. They didn't even raise that. Again, the ethnocentrism. British consumers did not mind. Okay, it didn't come up for them, but it was when it was being made in a developing country. Again, it can also reflect perhaps the anti-Japanese sentiment. However, that was being cultivated and shaped by Chinese consumers. Of course, we don't know for a fact how, but clearly that was coming through. A couple of things here as we start to draw to an end in the next few minutes. There's only a couple of slides to go. The role of brand origin and country of production. Okay, clearly we're interested in the interplay between these two items. Where does a brand come from? And particularly, but where is it being produced today in a world where a lot of production is being outsourced and manufactured outside the original country? Particularly we use Sony, a single case, simply to stop any contamination of other brands and what that might mean. So we needed to nuance it that way for British and Chinese consumers through two country of production settings, okay, Japan and Malaysia. What we effectively said is that the British have a preference for brands originating from developed countries compared to our Chinese consumers. So if you're from a developed country, there are some obvious lessons coming for us in the next slide. The country of production can devalue the brand, okay, has the potential. So my symbolism of the Mercedes up there being made in Papua New Guinea, produced and assembled in Papua New Guinea, would have very serious consequences. That's why many of these very elite and high status brands do not go into low cost type of options. You cannot have a low cost Mercedes. The day you do starts to effectively erode the entire brand family, okay? That's partly its attraction. We want high-end, high-status products because that's about differentiating ourselves from others. Consumer judgments are more positive, of course, when there's congruity, okay? That's great, between the brand name, the image, the country of production. Motivation wasn't a factor, so that was helpful to rule out. Both British and Chinese consumers are motivated by price, okay? Particularly if it's featured in a developing country. It has an impact on their willingness to pay, okay? It can erode that. People may say, well, I'm not sure you can charge a premium if it's being produced in a particular country, okay? So if you're in transit, imagine your own behaviour. You're in Dubai International Airport. You've got time, you're going to buy yourself something, perhaps a smartphone. You're going to buy a phone in Dubai, and you need to check, well, where was this made? You're coming back here to Singapore. Now, a question that you're probably going to ask yourself is, will I get the sort of after-sales support on this phone if I'm coming through here? Where was it made? We often have imperfect information, and these are the sorts of cues, information cues, and ideas that we will try and make those decisions. Developed countries, of course, for consumers in Britain, we've heard that. The image of a developing country, Malaysia, is very important for those coming from China. So Chinese consumers want to know about Malaysia. What's the image of a developing country? Because China, of course, is also developing. Now, thankfully, this study was undertaken before the disappearance of MH370. Of course, many of us knew it was a Malaysian Airlines carrying many Chinese nationals. So thank goodness we collected the data before that, because again, you could see what that may have done to our data. And of course, with practice, okay, again, we might try and shift our production to low-cost countries because of labour, but what we're saying is this can actually increase the risk of marginalising consumers in parts of the world which are a large base for you, where you're selling your product. So again, managers in the room might be saying, hey, we're very tempted by doing this. The offset is that you could actually jeopardise key markets in fairly lucrative and I guess countries with high income levels where people will buy your product, which is high-tech electronics. Also, of course, what we're saying here is this nuancing effect. We've found something by having this approach that we wouldn't have found if we'd only looked at developed countries or developing. So by combining in the one study, we were able to identify and reveal some of these, I guess, practice-based outcomes that managers today would say, hey, we need to know that. It's helpful research, because now our decision may need to be reconsidered about where our key markets are. That's also based on the size of your market, potential for market growth, and all sorts of things, profit margins in different country bases that you have. So this is a key kind of consideration. Don't be allured by the short-term tendency to reduce your production cost. That actually may increase cost with discarding of sales through other key markets, so be warned. Messages about country of production can certainly influence some in developed countries, but not others. Strong brand image in your developing country is important, particularly developing countries. Many of them are aspiring to becoming like a developed country. Okay, the middle class with some disposable income, they're growing that income. They want to experience the sorts of goods and services that people in developed countries have. Ethnocentrism and animosity, of course, and we looked at China and Japan. Of course, UK and Ireland have a fairly turbulent history. Pakistan and India, they're forever throwing things at each other across the border, and I'm not talking cricket balls. And so one way in which this may occur is that you can partner with local firms. Now, when Tesco went into South Korea initially, they partnered with Samsung Tesco. So this is a way in which you can have the ethnocentric advantage, but you partner in. So of course, your decision of how do I enter a market is also another set of questions. Last slide here is this. Of course, what we see is we've addressed a gap about this country of origin, country of production. We've seen that. A couple of limitations that, of course, like any piece of research, we can't say everything is perfect. It's not, and that's always the opportunity to say there's more research that we can do. But certainly we looked at only 3 cities in the UK, 3 cities in China. Okay, they're indicative of people with disposable income and who at least can afford to buy that product. That was our defence for that, but we can also argue differently. What if, in fact, we put a brand in from a developing country? Now, put there Corona. Some of us may not even know, but Corona is produced in Mexico. So what does that do if we put that product into our particular study? Now, of course, that's a sort of probably a fast-moving consumer good, FMCG, not an item like a Sony product where we're buying them infrequently with a price premium. Okay, so the purchase decision is also different, so we need to control for that. But what if that brand had come from a developing country? What would that have done for it? Age and gender weren't significant, okay, in our findings because we looked at that. That didn't come up. But are there any other sort of classic demographic or socio-demographic personality type variables that we should also look to include in future studies? Perhaps we also reflected on this, that maybe consumer animosity should be a separate construct from ethnocentrism, rather than just assuming you're from a country and you would support that country. Consumers can be particularly antagonistic now towards particular brands. I mean, we see a lot more, I guess, activist campaigns, consumer campaigns against so-called inappropriate behaviour by multinationals around the world. They can mobilise very, very quickly. Occupy Wall Street, social media, all of these things can quickly snowball on a global scale and put brand and company reputation at risk very, very quickly because of social media, among other things. And obviously some moderators here, such as previous experience with the brand. Have you bought a Sony in the past? Okay, clearly we didn't sort of look at that per se. What's your experience with that? So there's a few things like that with respect to where we could go, of course, with the study. And on that note, I'll thank you for your time, and I guess we've got some time if we wish. Thanks, Ken.